The temple was crowded with celebration. Thousands of Philistine men and women had gathered beneath its massive roof. Their rulers were present. Their priests had offered praise to Dagon, the god they believed had delivered their greatest enemy into their hands. Music, laughter, and triumphant shouting filled the building as people pressed forward to see the prisoner brought out for their entertainment. That prisoner was Samson. Once entire companies of soldiers had been unable to restrain him. Ropes had broken from his arms as though they were burned threads. City gates had been torn from their foundations and carried away on his shoulders. Armed men had learned to fear the sudden arrival of a single Israelite because no ordinary weapon seemed capable of stopping him. But now Samson stood blind. His eyes had been destroyed. Bronze chains had replaced the ropes he once snapped so easily. The man who had terrified Philistine cities had been reduced to grinding grain in prison, and now he had been brought into the temple so his enemies could mock him before their God. To the Philistines, Samson's story was over. His strength had vanished. His freedom was gone. His calling appeared to have ended in humiliation. The rulers who once offered a fortune for the secret of his power could now watch him stumble through the darkness. Yet, as Samson rested his hands against two central pillars, he began to pray. The people around him could not know that the final act of his life was about to become the deadliest blow he had ever struck against Philistine power. They could not know that the building in which they celebrated would soon become their tomb. And they could not know that the broken man standing before them had been chosen for this conflict before he was even born. How had Samson come to this place? How could a man set apart by God, blessed with extraordinary power, and called to begin Israel's deliverance, become a captive of the very people he was meant to oppose? The answer does not begin with Delilah. It does not begin with the cutting of his hair, the killing of a lion, or the riddle that transformed a wedding feast into violence. It begins before Samson's birth, during one of the darkest and most spiritually confused periods in Israel's history. Long before Israel had kings, the tribes lived in the land of Canaan without a permanent central government. Moses had died east of the Jordan. Joshua had led the people into the land, but after his generation passed away, Israel repeatedly abandoned the covenant that had shaped the nation. The book of Judges describes a destructive cycle. Israel turned away from the Lord and followed the gods of surrounding peoples. Foreign enemies gained power over them. Oppression became unbearable. The people cried out, and the Lord raised a judge, a deliverer, empowered to rescue Israel from its enemies. For a time, the land experienced relief, but when the judge died, the people returned to rebellion, often becoming more corrupt than the generation before them. This was not merely a political failure, it was a crisis of identity. Israel had been called to live as a people belonging to the Lord, distinct from the idolatry and injustice around them. Yet again and again, the nation adopted the practices of its neighbors. The people wanted the protection of the covenant without the obedience the covenant required. By the time Samson's story begins, the cycle has grown disturbingly familiar. The Israelites once again do what is evil in the sight of the Lord, and the Lord gives them into the hands of the Philistines for 40 years. The Philistines were not a minor band of raiders attacking isolated villages. They were an organized people, established along the southern coastal plain of Canaan. Their 5 major cities, Gaza, Ashkelon, Ashdod, Ekron, and Gath, formed a powerful political network. From these strongholds, Philistine influence reached inland toward Israelite territory. Samson's family lived near that contested region. Their town Zorah stood in the territory associated with the tribe of Dan, close to the borderlands, where Israelite settlements and Philistine control pressed against one another. The conflict was not distant. Philistine power existed near Israel's homes, fields, roads, and families. But something is different at the opening of Samson's story. Earlier in Judges, when Israel suffered under oppression, the text often states that the people cried out to the Lord. Here, no national cry for deliverance is recorded. The silence is significant. 40 years is long enough for oppression to become normal. A generation could be born, grow to adulthood, and raise children without knowing life outside Philistine domination. Israel may not have loved its condition, but the nation appears to have stopped expecting change. The greatest danger was not simply that the Philistines had power over Israel, it was that Israel seemed to have accepted it. Into this defeated and spiritually passive world, the story narrows, from nations and armies to one household. A man named Manoah lived in Zorah. He belonged to the clan of the Danites. Manoah had a wife, but the biblical text never gives her name. It identifies her instead through a source of private grief. She was unable to have children. In the ancient world, barrenness could carry emotional pain, social vulnerability, and uncertainty about a family's future. The text does not accuse Manoah's wife of wrongdoing, nor does it explain why she could not conceive. It simply presents a closed future. There was no child. There was no heir. There was no indication that this ordinary household would ever stand at the center of Israel's struggle with the Philistines. Then the angel of the Lord appeared to the woman. The encounter came without warning. No public ceremony had been arranged. No national leader was present. Israel had not gathered in repentance, and no army had requested a commander. The divine message came first to an unnamed woman in a border town. The messenger addressed the very condition that had defined her sorrow. She had been barren and had borne no children, but she would conceive and give birth to a son. The announcement contained instructions. She was to drink no wine or strong drink and eat nothing considered unclean. The child would be set apart to God from the womb, and no razor was to touch his head. This consecration was connected to the Nazirite vow described in the Law of Moses. A Nazirite was a person specially separated to the Lord for a period of devotion. The normal vow involved restrictions concerning products of the vine, the cutting of hair, and contact with the dead. Samson's case, however, was unusual. His separation was not the result of a vow he would freely choose as an adult. It was announced before his conception. His mother was required to observe special restrictions during pregnancy, and the child's consecration was intended to last throughout his life. Before Samson could speak, choose, fight, or fail, a calling had already been placed upon him. But the angel of the Lord did not promise that this child would completely destroy the Philistines or permanently free Israel. The wording was more limited and more revealing. He would begin to save Israel from the hand of the Philistines. Samson would be the beginning of deliverance, not its completion. His victories would weaken the oppressor. His actions would disrupt Philistine control. His life would open a conflict that would continue after his death. Later generations, including Samuel, Saul, and David, would still confront Philistine power. Samson's calling was therefore both extraordinary and incomplete. He would carry immense strength, but he would not carry the entire future of Israel on his shoulders. He would strike the first great blows in a struggle that others would continue. After the messenger departed, the woman went to Manoah. She described the visitor as a man of God, whose appearance was awe-inspiring, like that of an angel. She had not asked where he came from, and he had not told her his name, but she repeated the promise and the instructions. She would bear a son who would be a Nazirite to God from the womb until the day of his death. The phrase carried a shadow the parents could not yet understand. This child's consecration would continue until his death. Manoah responded by praying. He did not dismiss his wife's report. He did not demand proof from her. Instead, he asked the Lord to send the man of God again and teach them what they should do for the child who was to be born. His prayer reveals both faith and uncertainty. The promise was magnificent, but Manoah understood that a divine calling created responsibility. If this child belonged to a special purpose, how should his parents raise him? What discipline, preparation, and obedience would such a life require? God answered Manoah's prayer, but the angel of the Lord appeared again, first to the woman while she was sitting in a field. Manoah was not with her. She hurried to find him and told him that the visitor had returned. Manoah followed his wife to the messenger and asked whether he was the one who had spoken to her. The answer was simple: "I am." Manoah then asked what kind of life the boy should live and what his mission would be. The messenger did not provide a detailed plan for Samson's childhood education or future battles. Instead, he repeated the commands already given to the woman. She was to avoid everything produced by the grapevine, drink no wine or strong drink, eat nothing unclean, and observe all that had been commanded. The repetition matters. Manoah had asked how the boy should be raised, but the response again emphasized obedience to the instruction already given. Before the parents could understand everything about Samson's future, they were required to be faithful with what God had made clear. Manoah then asked the visitor to remain while he prepared a young goat. Hospitality was a serious responsibility, but the messenger told Manoah that even if he remained, he would not eat the food. If Manoah wished to prepare a burnt offering, he should offer it to the Lord. At this point, Manoah still did not fully understand the identity of the one speaking with him. He asked for the messenger's name so that he and his wife could honor him when the promised child was born. The response deepened the mystery. The angel of the Lord asked why Manoah sought his name, since it was beyond understanding, wonderful, extraordinary, too remarkable to be treated as an ordinary human name. Manoah took the young goat and a grain offering and presented them on a rock to the Lord. Then the extraordinary happened. As the flame rose from the altar toward heaven, the angel of the Lord ascended in the flame. Manoah and his wife fell face down to the ground. The visitor did not appear again, and Manoah finally understood that they had encountered the angel of the Lord. Overwhelmed by fear, he told his wife that they would surely die because they had seen God. But his wife answered with calm reasoning. If the Lord had intended to kill them, he would not have accepted their offering. He would not have shown them these things, and he would not have announced that they would have a son. In this moment, the unnamed woman appears as the clearer voice. Manoah saw the terrifying glory of the encounter and concluded that death must follow. His wife looked at the same encounter and recognized the evidence of mercy. The accepted sacrifice and the promised future did not point toward destruction, they pointed toward purpose. In time, the promise was fulfilled. The woman gave birth to a son and named him Samson. The text moves quickly across his childhood. It gives no stories of early feats of strength, no account of childhood adventures, and no description of the first time others noticed that he was different. It states simply that the boy grew and the Lord blessed him. Then, as Samson approached adulthood, the Spirit of the Lord began to stir him in Mahanadan, between Zorah and Eshtaol. Something was awakening. The child promised before birth was becoming the man who would confront the Philistines. The divine purpose announced to his mother was beginning to move from promise into action. Yet the story has already established a tension that will define Samson's entire life. He was chosen before he could choose. He was consecrated before he could understand consecration. He was given strength before he had demonstrated wisdom. And although the Spirit of the Lord had begun to stir him, extraordinary power would not remove the need for obedience, restraint, humility, and discernment. Israel needed a deliverer. God had raised one from a barren household in a conquered borderland. But the man who would soon prove strong enough to tear apart a lion would face a far more dangerous struggle, whether he could govern the desires within his own heart. The Spirit of the Lord had begun to stir Samson between Zorah and Eshtaol. The promised child was now becoming a man, and the purpose announced before his birth was moving closer to fulfillment. Yet the first major decision recorded from Samson's adult life does not look like the beginning of national deliverance. It begins with what he saw. Samson went down to Timnah, a town within the region influenced by the Philistines. There he saw a young Philistine woman. The text does not describe a conversation between them. It does not say that Samson knew her character, understood her family, or had considered how such a marriage would affect his calling. It emphasizes one fact: he saw her. Samson returned to his parents and announced that he had seen a Philistine woman in Timnah. He told them to get her for him as his wife. His parents were troubled. They asked whether there was no woman among his relatives or among all the people of Israel whom he could marry. Why must he go to the uncircumcised Philistines for a wife? Their objection was larger than family preference. Israel had been called to remain faithful to the Lord while living among nations devoted to other gods. Marriage in the ancient world did not join only two individuals. It connected households, loyalties, customs, inheritance, and religious life. Samson was not simply choosing a woman from a neighboring village. He was seeking a bond with the people who currently ruled over Israel. The Philistines were not neutral neighbors. They were the oppressors from whom Samson had been set apart to begin delivering his people. Yet Samson did not respond by explaining a plan. He did not tell his parents that he had received a command from God. He did not speak of Israel's suffering or of a strategy against Philistine power. He repeated his demand, "Get her for me, for she is right in my eyes." The phrase reveals the force driving his decision. Samson wanted what appeared desirable to him. This language also echoes the larger tragedy of the book of Judges. Near the end of the book, Israel's moral disorder is summarized with the statement that everyone did what was right in his own eyes. Samson's personal choices begin to reflect the same disorder affecting the nation he was meant to judge. He possessed a calling from God, but he was already learning to interpret desire as direction. This creates one of the central tensions in his story. Samson was not an ordinary man wandering without purpose. He had been consecrated before birth. The Lord had blessed him. The Spirit had begun to stir him. But divine calling did not cancel human responsibility. A person could be chosen for a purpose and still make reckless decisions. A person could receive supernatural strength and remain vulnerable to ordinary temptation. A person could be used by God while misunderstanding, resisting, or corrupting the very gifts placed in his hands. The narrator then gives the reader information Samson's parents did not possess. They did not know that this situation was from the Lord, who was seeking an occasion to confront the Philistines. This statement must be handled carefully. It does not mean that every desire in Samson's heart was righteous. It does not mean that God commanded Samson to be ruled by physical attraction, and it does not turn all the suffering that follows into morally good behavior. The text shows divine sovereignty working through a deeply human and morally complicated decision. The Philistines had dominated Israel for 40 years. Israel had not risen to resist them. No army had gathered around Samson. No elders had called him to lead a revolt. The people had become accustomed to submission. The conflict would therefore begin in an unexpected way. Samson's private desire would create an opportunity for confrontation. What he intended as a marriage would become the spark of a widening conflict between himself and the Philistines. God could use Samson's choices without approving everything within them. That distinction is essential to understanding his life. Scripture often records the Lord accomplishing His purposes through people whose motives are mixed. Divine sovereignty does not transform selfishness into virtue. Instead, it reveals that human failure cannot place God outside the events of history. Samson traveled toward Timnah with his father and mother. The route descended from the hill country toward the lower valleys associated with Philistine territory. Near the vineyards of Timnah, a young lion suddenly came roaring toward him. The detail is striking. Samson had been consecrated as a Nazirite, a calling associated with separation from products of the vine, yet the first recorded demonstration of his strength takes place near vineyards. The text does not say that Samson drank wine there. It does not accuse him of breaking his consecration at that moment, but the location introduces a pattern that will follow him throughout the story. Samson repeatedly moves near the boundaries of what should have reminded him that he belonged to God. The lion attacked. There is no mention of a sword, spear, or hunting weapon in Samson's hands. There is no group of soldiers beside him. His parents were somewhere along the journey, but the encounter appears to have taken place outside their sight. Then the Spirit of the Lord rushed upon Samson. The young man seized the lion and tore it apart as easily as one might tear apart a young goat. The image is almost impossible to separate from later legends about Samson's power, but the biblical text places the source of that strength beyond Samson himself. His ability was not the result of ordinary training. It was not merely a natural gift hidden in an unusually powerful body. The Spirit of the Lord empowered him. This would remain true each time Samson performed feats no ordinary warrior could accomplish. His strength was real, but it was entrusted strength. The lion lay dead. Samson continued on his way, but he told neither his father nor his mother what he had done. This is the first secret recorded in his adult life. The secrecy may have had practical reasons. Perhaps he did not wish to explain the encounter. Perhaps he treated it as a private event. The text does not reveal his thoughts, but it establishes a pattern. Samson repeatedly separates his public life from his hidden life. His parents know of his desire for the woman, but not of the lion. Later, they will eat honey he gives them without knowing where it came from. His wedding companions will hear a riddle built on an experience only Samson understands. His wife will pressure him to disclose what he has concealed. Delilah will eventually ask him to reveal the deepest secret of his consecration. Strength and secrecy will remain closely connected in Samson's story. He goes down to Timnah and speaks with the woman. The text then says that she was right in Samson's eyes. Again, his evaluation is shaped by what pleases him. No spiritual compatibility is mentioned. No act of wisdom is described. The relationship moves forward because Samson is determined to possess what he has chosen. Sometime later, he returned to take her as his wife. Along the way, Samson turned aside to look at the carcass of the lion he had killed. The phrase, "turned aside," is important. The carcass was not simply blocking his path. Samson deliberately left the route to revisit the place where his strength had first been displayed. Inside the remains of the lion, he discovered a swarm of bees and honey. The scene contains a strange contrast. Death had become the setting for sweetness. The predator that came to destroy Samson now held food within its remains. What had once roared against him had become harmless. Samson reached into the carcass, took the honey in his hands, and ate it as he continued walking. When he reached his parents, he gave some to them, and they also ate. But he did not tell them that the honey had come from the lion's carcass. This moment raises a serious question about Samson's consecration. The Nazirite regulations in Numbers prohibited contact with a dead body during the period of the vow. Samson's situation was unique because his consecration had been established from the womb. But contact with the remains of the lion stands in obvious tension with the life of separation he had been called to live. The narrative does not stop to announce a formal violation. It does not state that Samson lost his strength or that the Lord immediately judged him, but the scene is not presented casually. Samson had touched what his calling should have taught him to avoid, and he concealed the source of the honey from his parents. The issue was not that honey itself was forbidden. The issue was where Samson had taken it from and what his secrecy revealed about his relationship to consecration. He was learning to approach sacred boundaries without fear. He could reach into death, take what pleased him, conceal the truth, and continue toward his wedding as though nothing had happened. This is how compromise often develops. It rarely begins with a person openly renouncing everything he once believed. It begins when a boundary is treated as inconvenient, when secrecy appears easier than explanation, and when the absence of immediate consequences is mistaken for permission. Samson still possessed his strength. The Lord's purpose had not disappeared, but strength without reverence was becoming dangerous. Samson's father went down to arrange the marriage, and Samson prepared a feast, as young men commonly did. The wedding celebration would last several days. Food, social obligations, gifts, honor, and public reputation were all involved. Such feasts could create formal bonds between households, but in Samson's case, the celebration placed an Israelite chosen to oppose the Philistines in the middle of a Philistine social gathering. When the Philistines saw him, they provided 30 companions to remain with him. The text does not explain whether these men were simply members of the wedding party guards assigned because Samson was an outsider, or companions chosen to observe him. They may have served several purposes at once. Their presence should have warned Samson that he was not among trusted friends. He was surrounded by men connected to the people ruling over Israel. His marriage had brought him into a celebration where every relationship carried political tension. Yet Samson did not withdraw. Instead, he decided to test them. He proposed a riddle. If the 30 men could solve it during the 7 days of the feast, Samson would give them 30 linen garments and 30 changes of clothing. But if they could not solve it, they would owe the same number of garments to him. The wager was expensive. Clothing in the ancient world required labor and carried value. 30 sets of garments represented far more than a casual game. Samson was placing wealth, honor, and reputation at stake. The companions accepted. "Tell us your riddle," they said. Samson then gave them words drawn from the secret experience they could not possibly know. Out of the eater came something to eat, and out of the strong came something sweet. The eater was the lion, the food was the honey. The strong creature had produced sweetness after death. To Samson, the riddle was clever because its answer depended on a private event. He was not asking the men to solve a common proverb or interpret a familiar symbol. He had designed a puzzle whose solution was locked inside his own hidden knowledge. The same secrecy that had kept his parents from understanding, the honey now gave him power over the men at the feast. For a time it worked. The companions could not solve the riddle. They examined the words, they searched for a meaning, they may have offered guesses, argued among themselves, and watched Samson for signs of weakness. But the answer remained beyond their reach, because they had not seen the lion. As the days passed, the wager began to threaten more than money. The men faced public humiliation. A foreigner, an Israelite living under Philistine domination, had placed them in a contest they could not win. If they failed, each man would owe valuable garments to Samson. What had begun as entertainment was becoming an insult, and when the Philistine companions could not defeat the riddle through intelligence, they turned toward intimidation. They did not attack Samson directly. They went to the woman he intended to marry. She stood between two worlds, bound by marriage arrangements to Samson, but surrounded by her own people. Her family and future were vulnerable to the men attending the feast. They demanded that she persuade her husband to reveal the answer. If she refused, They threatened to burn her and her father's household with fire. The wedding celebration had become a trap. Samson believed he controlled the feast because he possessed a secret no one else knew, but his companions had discovered a way around his strength. They would not try to tear the answer from Samson's hands. They would force it through the person closest to him. And for the first time, Samson's hidden life was about to become a weapon in someone else's hands. The men at Samson's wedding feast had failed to solve his riddle. For days they had listened to the words again and again. Out of the eater came something to eat, and out of the strong came something sweet. The answer remained hidden because the riddle did not depend on ordinary knowledge. It depended on Samson's private encounter with the lion and the honey, an event he had told no one. Unable to defeat him through reason, the Philistine companions chose another method. They threatened the woman who was about to become Samson's wife. "Persuade your husband to explain the riddle," they demanded, "or we will burn you and your father's household with fire." The threat exposed the reality beneath the wedding celebration. The feast may have appeared festive, but fear controlled the people inside it. Samson believed he had entered a marriage relationship. The woman's companions saw her as a tool. Her family's safety could be sacrificed to protect their own wealth and honor. The woman now stood between Samson's secrecy and the violence of her own people. She went to him, weeping. "You only hate me," she said. "You do not love me. You have given my people a riddle, but you have not told me its meaning." Samson answered that he had not even told his father or mother. Why then should he tell her? His response reveals how little trust existed inside the relationship. Samson had demanded this marriage because the woman was right in his eyes, but the narrative never shows a deep bond of honesty between them. She did not tell him that the men had threatened to kill her family. He did not explain why the secret mattered to him. Both responded to danger through concealment. She hid the threat. He guarded the answer. What had begun through attraction now faced a crisis that attraction alone could not overcome. For the remaining days of the feast, the woman wept before Samson. She pressed him continually, using the language of rejection and love. The text does not excuse her betrayal, but neither does it hide the terror behind her actions. She had been placed under a threat of death. The men had made it clear that refusal would cost not only her life, but also the lives and property of her family. Samson, however, did not know what she knew. To him, her tears appeared to be an attempt to force open a secret he had chosen to keep. By the seventh day, Samson could no longer endure the pressure. He told her the answer. The moment is brief, but it establishes a pattern that will eventually destroy him. Samson could withstand physical attack. He could kill a lion with his bare hands. He could face armed men without fear. But persistent emotional pressure weakened his judgment. He knew the secret gave him control over the contest. He knew his companions could not solve the riddle without help. Yet when the pressure became constant, he surrendered what he had protected. The woman immediately told the men. Before sunset on the seventh day, they approached Samson with their answer. "What is sweeter than honey?" they asked. "And what is stronger than a lion?" They had solved the riddle, but Samson understood at once that they had not discovered the answer by wisdom, they had reached it through his wife. His reply was sharp and bitter. "If you had not plowed with my heifer, you would not have solved my riddle." The expression comes from an agricultural world and sounds harsh to modern listeners. Samson was accusing the men of using someone who belonged within his household to gain access to what was his. His anger was not only about losing the wager. He had been betrayed at the beginning of his marriage. The person he expected to stand with him had given his secret to the men surrounding them. Yet Samson did not ask why she had done it. He did not discover the threat against her family. He saw the betrayal, but not the fear behind it. This inability to understand the full situation would drive the conflict toward violence. The Spirit of the Lord rushed upon Samson. He went down to Ashkelon, one of the 5 major Philistine cities. There he killed 30 men, took their belongings, and gave their garments to the men who had explained the riddle. The wager was paid, but it was paid with blood. 30 men who had not attended the wedding died so that Samson could satisfy an obligation created by his own contest. The text records that the Spirit empowered Samson, but it does not require the reader to treat every element of his motive as morally pure. Again, divine purpose and human anger move through the same event. God had declared that Samson would begin to deliver Israel from Philistine domination. The confrontation had now begun. Philistine lives had been taken, and a conflict had opened between Samson and the people who ruled over Israel. But from Samson's perspective, this was not yet a campaign for national freedom. It was personal. He was angry because he had been deceived. He struck Philistines because his honor had been wounded. His calling was moving forward, but Samson himself had not yet developed a vision larger than his own offense. This distinction will remain throughout his story. Samson often fought the enemies of Israel, but his reasons were usually tied to what they had done to him personally. He did not gather the tribes around the covenant. He did not call Israel to repentance. He did not establish justice among the people. He reacted. Each injury produced another act of strength. Each insult awakened another wave of anger. The result was conflict with the Philistines, but not yet leadership among Israel. After paying the wager, Samson returned to his father's house in furious anger. He did not remain with his wife. He did not try to repair the relationship. He left. His departure created uncertainty. The marriage arrangements had been made. The feast had taken place, but Samson had abandoned the celebration before the relationship had settled into ordinary life. The woman's father interpreted the departure as rejection. He assumed Samson hated her and would not return. So he gave her to the man who had served as Samson's chief companion at the wedding. The decision may have appeared practical to the father. In his eyes, Samson had left in anger and disappeared. A marriage connection had failed, and another arrangement could preserve the woman's future. But Samson had not formally released her. He had not agreed to the new marriage. And when he eventually returned, he would discover that another man had taken the woman he still considered his wife. The wedding feast had created an expanding chain of consequences. Samson's desire had brought him into Timnah. His secret had produced the riddle. The riddle had produced the wager. The wager had produced a threat. The threat had produced betrayal. The betrayal had produced 30 deaths. And Samson's angry departure had now produced another marriage. No one involved had resolved the original conflict. They had only passed it forward. This is one of the defining patterns in Samson's story. A private decision becomes a public crisis because every person responds to injury with another injury. The Philistine men threaten the woman. The woman betrays Samson. Samson kills men in Ashkelon. The father gives Samson's wife to another man. Each action appears to answer what came before, but every answer creates a greater offense. The story is moving toward revenge, and revenge rarely remains limited to the people who began the conflict. After some time had passed, Samson returned to Timnah during the wheat harvest. He brought a young goat, likely as a gift, and went to visit his wife. His actions show that he did not consider the marriage over. He told her father that he intended to go into his wife's room, but the father stopped him. "I was certain that you hated her," he explained, "so I gave her to your companion." The words confirmed that Samson's place had been taken by the very man connected to the feast where the betrayal occurred. Then the father attempted to offer a substitute. He pointed to the woman's younger sister and claimed she was more beautiful. Samson could marry her instead. To the father, this may have seemed like a reasonable solution to a damaged arrangement. To Samson, it was another insult. The woman he had demanded as his wife had been handed to another man without his permission, and now her younger sister was being offered as compensation. Samson's response revealed that he was no longer thinking in terms of reconciliation. This time, he said, "I will be innocent when I harm the Philistines." He now considered himself justified. The first violence at Ashkelon had followed the loss of the Riddle. The next act would follow the loss of his wife. In Samson's mind, the Philistines had created the conditions for their own punishment. Yet his words also show a dangerous shift. Samson was becoming the judge of his own innocence. He decided when he was justified. He decided how much retaliation the offense deserved. He decided that personal injury gave him permission to strike far beyond the household that had wronged him. The wheat harvest was one of the most economically vulnerable moments of the year. Grain stood ready in the fields. Vineyards and olive groves represented months and years of labor. The produce of the land supported families, trade, and political power. Samson chose this moment to act. He caught 300 foxes, or possibly jackals, as the Hebrew term can refer to wild canines that moved through the region. He paired them tail to tail, attached a torch between each pair, lit the torches, and released the animals into the standing grain of the Philistines. The result was devastating. Fire spread through the fields. The flames consumed standing grain, harvested sheaves, vineyards, and olive orchards. This was no longer a private dispute between Samson and one family. The destruction struck the economic life of an entire Philistine community. Farmers who had never attended the wedding lost their crops. Households that had not threatened Samson's wife saw their harvest burn. What began with one marriage had become collective punishment. The Philistines demanded to know who had done it. When they learned that Samson was responsible, they also learned why. The Timnite father had given Samson's wife to his companion. The community now turned against the household at the center of the dispute. They seized the woman and her father and burned them with fire. The threat made at the wedding feast had finally been carried out. The woman had betrayed Samson because she feared that she and her family would be burned. Yet the betrayal did not save them. The very violence she had tried to avoid returned through a different path. The tragedy is severe. The men at the feast had created the threat. Samson's anger had expanded the conflict. The father's decision had deepened the insult. The community's retaliation completed the destruction. No one emerged innocent. When Samson learned what the Philistines had done, he did not interpret the deaths as the end of the conflict. He saw them as another offense requiring another answer. "If this is what you do," he declared, "I will not stop until I have taken revenge on you." The cycle had become self-sustaining. Samson had attacked because his wife was given away. The Philistines had killed her because Samson burned their harvest. Now Samson would attack because they had killed her. Each side could point backward to justify the next act, but no act of revenge could restore what had already been lost. The marriage was gone. The woman was dead. Her father was dead. 30 men in Ashkelon were dead. The harvest was destroyed. And still the conflict was only beginning. Samson struck the Philistines with a great slaughter. The biblical description is brief and forceful. It does not provide a battle map, a number of casualties, or the names of those he killed. It emphasizes the severity of the attack. Afterward, Samson withdrew to a cave in the rock of Edom. For the first time in the story, he appears separated from both Philistine society and his own people. His attempted marriage had failed. His wife had betrayed him and then been killed. The Philistines wanted revenge. and Israel had not joined his struggle. Samson had struck Israel's oppressors, but he had not become the leader of an uprising. He was a solitary warrior hiding in a rocky stronghold. The Philistines responded by sending forces into Judah. They camped near Lehi and spread through the area. The people of Judah asked why they had come against them. The answer revealed how Philistine power operated. They had not come to wage war against all Judah, they said. They had come to capture Samson and do to him what he had done to them. The Philistines presented their mission as justice. Samson had attacked them, so they would repay him. But their army stood inside Israelite territory, and Judah's reaction showed how deeply submission had entered the nation's thinking. 3,000 men of Judah went down to the cave at Etam. This was a large force, more than enough to form the beginning of an Israelite army. They knew where Samson was. They knew he had struck the Philistines. They knew the Philistines oppressed their people. But they did not come to ask Samson to lead them. They came to surrender him. "Do you not know that the Philistines rule over us?" they asked. The words reveal the spiritual and political condition Samson had been born to confront. The men of Judah did not say that Philistine rule was temporary. They did not speak of a Lord's covenant or Israel's calling. They treated domination as an unquestionable fact. "The Philistines rule over us. Why then have you created trouble to them?" Samson was not yet a deliverer. He was a threat to the fragile peace of submission. Samson answered that he had only done to the Philistines what they had done to him. His response matched the logic of the entire conflict. They acted. He repaid them. They retaliated. He retaliated again. Even now, Samson framed the struggle in personal terms. The men of Judah told him they had come to bind him and hand him over to the Philistines. Samson did not attack his own people. Instead, he demanded a promise that they would not kill him themselves. They agreed. "We will only bind you and deliver you into their hands." The statement captures the tragedy of Israel's condition. The men of Judah would not kill Samson, but they were willing to place him into the hands of those who would. They bound him with 2 new ropes and led him away from the rock. The man chosen to begin Israel's deliverance was now tied by Israelites and carried toward the Philistines. His own people had become the instruments of their oppressors. Ahead of them, the Philistines waited. When they saw Samson approaching in bonds, they shouted in triumph. From their perspective, the conflict had ended. The dangerous Israelite had been restrained. His own people had surrendered him. The ropes were new. 3,000 men had ensured that he could not escape. But the Philistines had made the same mistake others would make throughout Samson's life. They believed the ropes were the source of his captivity. They did not understand that Samson's strength had never belonged to the ropes to his muscles or even to the hair that had never been cut. As the Philistine shouting grew louder, the Spirit of the Lord rushed upon him. The ropes around his arms became like burned flax. The bonds fell from his hands, and on the ground nearby lay the fresh jawbone of a donkey. Samson reached for it. Samson reached for the fresh jawbone of a donkey. Around him, the Philistines were still shouting. Only moments earlier, they had watched the men of Judah bring Samson down from the rock of Etam with 2 new ropes wrapped around his arms. To them, the sight confirmed everything they believed about Israel. Samson's own people had submitted. No uprising had begun. No army had formed behind him. The man who had burned their fields and struck their people now stood bound before them. But when the Spirit of the Lord rushed upon Samson, the ropes fell away like flax touched by fire. The Philistine celebration became panic. Samson seized the jawbone and attacked. The weapon was unimpressive. It had not been forged by a smith sharpened for battle or carried by a trained soldier. It was the discarded bone of a dead animal. Yet in Samson's hand, under the power of the Spirit, it became enough. The text says that Samson struck down 1,000 men. The number emphasizes the overwhelming nature of the victory. Samson had no supporting army. The 3,000 men of Judah had not joined him. They had brought him to the battlefield as a prisoner, and now watched the man they had surrendered break free and turn against the Philistine force. The scene exposed the difference between Israel's fear and God's purpose. Judah had looked at the Philistines and seen an authority too powerful to challenge. The Philistines had looked at Samson's ropes and believed he was defeated. But neither side had accounted for the Spirit of the Lord. Samson fought until the attackers lay fallen around him. The place that was meant to become the site of his execution became the site of a Philistine disaster. Afterward, Samson spoke in the form of a short victory song. With the jawbone of a donkey, heaps upon heaps, with the jawbone of a donkey, I have struck down 1,000 men. The lines contain wordplay in Hebrew, connecting the word for donkey with the word for heaps. Samson celebrated the irony of what had happened. With a weapon that appeared worthless, he had created piles of defeated enemies. The song is bold. It is also centered almost entirely on Samson. He speaks of the jawbone. He speaks of the heaps. He speaks of what he has done. The Spirit of the Lord had empowered him, but Samson's victory song does not explicitly mention the Lord. This does not prove that Samson denied God's involvement. The narrative itself has already told the reader where his strength came from. But the contrast is difficult to ignore. The Spirit supplied the power. Samson claimed the victory. This tension had appeared before and would continue growing. Samson's strength came from beyond himself, yet he often behaved as though it existed for his own anger, reputation, and survival. When he finished speaking, Samson threw away the jawbone. The place was named Ramoth-Lehi, meaning something like the hill of the jawbone. The victory had been so great that the landscape itself carried the memory of it. But immediately after this display of nearly unimaginable power, Samson's condition changed. He became desperately thirsty. The transition is sudden. One moment, Samson stands over a defeated army. The next, he is close to collapse. The same man who had broken ropes and killed 1,000 enemies could not command his own body to produce water. Strength had carried him through battle, but strength could not keep him alive without the most basic necessity. His throat dried, his energy failed, the heat of the region, the violence of the fight, and the loss of bodily strength left him in danger. For the first time in the Samson narrative, the strong man openly cries out to God. "You have given this great deliverance by the hand of your servant," he says. "Must I now die of thirst and fall into the hands of the uncircumcised?" His prayer contains both recognition and complaint. Samson finally acknowledges that the victory was given by God. He calls himself the Lord's servant and describes what has happened as a great deliverance. Yet even in prayer, the words remain urgent and intensely personal. Would God give such a victory and then allow him to die? Would the one who had destroyed a Philistine force now become helpless before the survivors? Would the deliverer's story end not beneath a sword, but from thirst beside the battlefield? Samson's cry reveals something essential about him. He often recognized his dependence on God most clearly when his own power had reached its limit. As long as his arms could break the ropes, he acted. As long as his anger could direct his strength, he struck. But thirst could not be torn apart. It could not be frightened, beaten, or carried away on his shoulders. The battle had ended, and now Samson faced an enemy that physical force could not defeat. God answered him. The text says that God split open a hollow place at Lehi, and water came out. Samson drank, his strength returned, and he revived. The place received another name. En-Hakkore, meaning the spring of the one who called. The name preserved not merely the memory of Samson's strength, but the memory of his dependence. Ramoth-Lehi remembered the jawbone, En-Hakkore remembered the prayer. Together, the names reveal the two realities of Samson's life. He was extraordinarily powerful. He was completely dependent. The man who could defeat 1,000 enemies still needed God to provide a drink of water. This moment could have transformed him. Samson had seen that victory did not make him self-sufficient. He had experienced both divine empowerment and divine provision. He had learned that strength could disappear within moments when the body was exhausted and life was threatened. Yet the narrative does not show Samson turning from his old patterns. There is no recorded confession concerning the cycle of revenge. There is no effort to call Israel back to covenant faithfulness. There is no assembly of the tribes. There is no declaration that the Lord, not Samson, must rule the nation. Instead, the story pauses. The biblical text states that Samson judged Israel for 20 years during the days of the Philistines. That single sentence covers a long period of his life. 20 years is not a brief interval. Children could be born and reach adulthood during that time. Families could rise, change, and disappear. Political alliances could shift. Philistine pressure could grow or weaken in different regions. Yet, Scripture provides almost no description of Samson's work as judge during these years. It does not list court cases he decided. It does not describe villages he protected. It does not name followers, officials, or military commanders. It does not record reforms, altars, laws, or national assemblies. The silence must be respected. Later storytellers might be tempted to fill these years with imagined campaigns, secret victories, or heroic adventures. But the biblical account does not give such details. It simply says that Samson judged Israel for 20 years in the days of the Philistines. This statement confirms that Samson's role was larger than a sequence of personal fights. He did function as a judge. His impact extended beyond one wedding, one harvest, or one battlefield. But the phrase, "in the days of the Philistines," also reminds the reader that his judgeship did not end their domination. The Philistines remained powerful. Their cities still stood. Their rulers still governed. Israel was not fully delivered. This was consistent with the announcement made before Samson's birth. He would begin to save Israel from the Philistines. His life opened resistance, but it did not complete liberation. The incompleteness of Samson's mission mirrors the incompleteness within Samson himself. He possessed power, but lacked stability. He could defeat external enemies, but did not consistently master internal impulses. He could become an instrument of deliverance without becoming the kind of leader who transformed the spiritual life of the nation. Earlier judges had often gathered armies. Othniel had gone out to war. Ehud had summoned Israel after killing Eglon. Deborah and Barak had called tribes into battle. Gideon had reduced an army and led a campaign against Midian. Jephthah had commanded forces against the Ammonites. Samson was different. He fought alone. His victories were personal confrontations that carried national consequences. He did not ask Israel to follow him, and Israel did not appear eager to do so. The men of Judah had already shown that they preferred submission to resistance. This isolation made Samson dangerous to the Philistines, but it also limited the kind of deliverance he could produce. One man could destroy a field. One man could strike down a military force. One man could terrify a city. But one man, acting alone, could not renew Israel's covenant, rebuild its courage, and establish lasting freedom. The nation needed more than a weapon. It needed faithful leadership. Samson's life forces the reader to distinguish between charisma and character. Charisma is the power to affect others. Character is the inward formation that determines how power will be used. Samson had extraordinary charisma. In the most literal sense, he had received a remarkable divine gift. When the Spirit rushed upon him, ordinary restraints became useless. But his character did not grow at the same rate as his power. He remained impulsive. He remained secretive. He continued to allow desire to guide major decisions. He repeatedly treated danger as something he could escape through strength. This imbalance made every victory unstable. The stronger Samson appeared, the easier it became for him to assume that consequences would never reach him. He had survived the lion. He had survived the wedding betrayal. He had survived Ashkelon. He had survived the burning fields and the retaliation that followed. He had survived the Philistine attack. He had survived being bound by his own people. He had survived a battle against 1,000 men. Even death from thirst had been turned back when God opened a spring. Again and again, Samson moved toward danger and emerged alive. A pattern of rescue can produce gratitude, but in an undisciplined heart, it can also produce presumption. Samson could begin to believe that because God had used him before, God would always rescue him in the same way. That belief would become one of the most dangerous illusions of his life. Divine patience is not permission. Repeated escape is not proof that a path is safe. And a gift that remains active is not evidence that every choice is approved. The book of Judges repeatedly shows that God's mercy can work through people who are far from complete. The judges themselves become increasingly troubled as the book progresses. At the beginning, Othniel is described with little moral complication. Ehud delivers Israel through deception and assassination. Barak hesitates. Gideon begins in fear, wins by faith, and ends by creating an object that becomes a snare. Jephthah delivers Israel but makes a devastating vow. Samson stands near the end of this downward movement. He is perhaps the strongest judge physically, yet his personal life is among the most disordered. This is not accidental. Israel's judges increasingly reflect the nation they lead. Israel is consecrated but compromised. Samson is consecrated but compromised. Israel follows what is right in its own eyes. Samson demands what is right in his eyes. Israel possesses a calling but repeatedly turns toward foreign gods. Samson possesses a calling but repeatedly moves toward Philistine women and Philistine territory. The deliverer resembles the people who need deliverance. That is the deeper crisis. Samson could fight the Philistines outside Israel, but the influence of Philistine culture had already entered Israel's desires, relationships, and imagination. The nation had adapted to domination. Samson resisted domination through violence, but he remained attracted to the world of the oppressor. He wanted Philistine women. He entered Philistine celebrations. He moved through Philistine cities. He sought satisfaction within the very society he had been called to confront. This does not mean every Philistine individual was personally responsible for Israel's oppression. Nor does it mean that Samson's attraction alone explains his failure. The issue is that Samson repeatedly moved toward places where his calling, desire, and secrecy collided. He did not merely visit the boundary, he lived at it. The vineyards near Timnah had placed him near the restrictions of his consecration. The lion's carcass had placed him near ritual defilement. The wedding feast had placed him among men who would threaten and manipulate his household. The jawbone had come from a dead animal. Each scene brought Samson close to something his consecration should have taught him to approach carefully. Yet no immediate collapse followed. His strength remained. The Spirit still came upon him. The victories continued. This may have taught Samson the wrong lesson. He may have concluded that the visible gift mattered more than the invisible obedience. As long as he could still break ropes, perhaps, he believed the relationship with God was secure. As long as enemies still fell, perhaps he believed compromise had no cost. As long as he survived, perhaps he believed he could always return from danger. But the absence of immediate judgment does not erase the direction of a life. A downfall can begin long before anyone sees it. It begins in repeated patterns. It begins in warnings, dismissed because nothing happened last time. It begins when a person confuses being used by God with being beyond accountability. For 20 years, Samson judged Israel. For 20 years, the Philistines remained. For 20 years, his strength continued to make him feared. But the unresolved weakness within him remained as well. The Jawbone victory had shown that no army could easily defeat Samson from the outside. The spring at Lehi had shown that even the strongest man could be brought to helplessness. Yet the next great threat to Samson would not arrive as an army. It would not shout from across a battlefield. It would not bind him in public. It would approach through desire, secrecy, confidence, and the belief that he could walk into danger one more time and escape as he always had before. The Philistines had failed to capture Samson through force. Soon they would learn that they did not need to overpower his strength. They only needed to understand his weakness. For 20 years, Samson judged Israel during the days of the Philistines. The biblical account compresses those 2 decades into a single sentence. It does not tell us how Samson governed disputes, protected villages, or responded to every Philistine threat. It does not describe a court, an army, a household, or a circle of advisors. It does not record whether Israel's leaders honored him, feared him, or merely tolerated him because the Philistines feared him more. The silence is important. Samson's life is remembered not through a stable administration, but through moments of explosive power. His story moves from crisis to crisis, from desire to danger, from provocation to retaliation. Even the long period in which he judged Israel is surrounded by uncertainty. Perhaps his reputation alone restrained Philistine aggression in parts of the region. Perhaps stories of the lion, the burned harvest, and the 1,000 men at Lehi traveled through towns on both sides of the border. Perhaps Philistine commanders learned that pursuing Samson could bring disaster. But Scripture does not invite us to build an imaginary heroic career within those missing years. It allows the silence to remain. And when the narrative begins moving again, Samson has not become the disciplined national leader his calling required. He goes to Gaza. Gaza was not a small settlement near his home. It was one of the 5 principal cities of the Philistines, a major center of power near the Mediterranean coast. Its fortified gates controlled entry and exit. Its rulers participated in the political system that dominated Israel. For Samson to enter Gaza was to move deep into hostile territory. Yet he did not go there at the head of an army. He entered the house of a prostitute. The text offers no explanation for his decision. It does not suggest a military plan hidden beneath the visit. It simply records another moment in which Samson's desire draws him into Philistine territory. Years had passed since Timnah. He had experienced betrayal, violence, thirst, divine rescue, and 2 decades of responsibility. But the weakness had not disappeared. Time alone had not transformed him. Spiritual gifts can continue for years while inward patterns remain unchanged. Public usefulness can hide private disorder. A person may grow older, become more experienced, and gain a reputation without ever confronting the desires that repeatedly place his calling at risk. Samson had defeated external enemies, but he had not learned to stop walking willingly into their cities. The people of Gaza were told that Samson had entered. News moved quickly. The man who had humiliated Philistine communities was now inside one of their strongest cities. This appeared to be the opportunity they had been waiting for. They surrounded the area and set an ambush at the city gate. They remained quiet through the night, saying to one another that they would wait until dawn and then kill him. Their plan depended on the city itself. At night, the gates would be shut. Samson would be trapped inside the walls. Armed men could watch every exit. When daylight came, they could attack him together. For once, the Philistines did not need to chase him across open country. He had entered their stronghold by choice. Samson remained until midnight. Then he rose. The text does not explain how he learned of the ambush or whether he simply chose to leave earlier than expected. But when he reached the gate, the massive structure stood between him and escape. Ancient city gates were not ordinary doors. They were central to the security, commerce, and public life of a city. Gate complexes could include heavy wooden doors, bars, supporting posts, guard chambers, and fortified walls. They represented authority and protection. To control the gate was to control the city's movement. The Philistines believed the gate had trapped Samson. Instead, Samson seized it. He took hold of the doors, the two posts, and the bar. He tore the entire structure from its place, lifted it onto his shoulders, and carried it toward the hill facing Hebron. The act was more than an escape. Samson did not merely break open a passage and run. He removed the symbol of Gaza's security and carried it away. The city that believed it had imprisoned him awoke to find its gateway uprooted. Its defenses had become Samson's burden. Its trap had become its humiliation. The distance and terrain make the feat extraordinary. Samson carried the gate uphill, away from the Philistine stronghold, and toward the interior associated with Judah. Once again, no ordinary explanation is sufficient. The strength that tore apart the lion, broke new ropes, and wielded the jawbone was still present. The Philistines had surrounded him. They had closed the gate. They had waited for morning, and still Samson escaped. This victory may have deepened the illusion already shaping his life. He had entered danger because of desire and left carrying the city's defenses on his shoulders. There had been no visible consequence. No chain held him. No army stopped him. No wall contained him. Each escape could have taught him to fear God more deeply. Instead, it may have taught him to fear danger less. Samson had survived so many reckless choices that he could begin to assume survival was guaranteed. He did not yet understand that repeated deliverances could become the setting for greater presumption. The strongest walls in Gaza had failed, but Samson's downfall would not come through walls. The Philistines had tried ropes. They had tried soldiers. They had tried an ambush. They had tried a fortified city. None of these had worked because they attacked Samson where he was strongest. The next conflict would unfold differently. After the event at Gaza, Samson fell in love with a woman in the valley of Sorek. Her name was Delilah. This is the first time the text explicitly says that Samson loved one of the women connected to his story. He had seen the woman in Timnah and demanded her as his wife because she was right in his eyes. He had gone to the prostitute in Gaza without any description of emotional attachment. But with Delilah, the narrator uses the language of love. The statement gives the coming betrayal greater weight. Samson's enemies would not merely use physical attraction against him. They would use someone to whom he had given emotional access. The valley of Sorek lay near the border region between Israelite and Philistine territory, not far from Samson's homeland. The location fits the pattern of his life. He lived between two peoples, between consecration and compromise, between divine purpose and personal desire. The text does not explicitly identify Delilah as Philistine. Her name, location, and association with the Philistine rulers have led many readers to assume that she was, but Scripture does not state her ethnicity directly. What it makes clear is that the rulers of the Philistines believed they could approach her and use her relationship with Samson. The 5 Philistine rulers came to Delilah. Their offer was direct. Entice him, they told her. Find out where his great strength lies, and how we may overpower him, bind him, and humble him. They did not ask her to kill Samson herself. They wanted information. After years of defeat, the Philistine leadership had finally changed its strategy. They understood that Samson's strength was connected to some secret they had not discovered. If they could learn the source of his power, they believed they could remove it. Each ruler offered Delilah 1,100 pieces of silver. If all 5 rulers participated, the total would have been enormous. The exact modern value cannot be calculated with certainty, but the offer clearly represented a fortune. This was not a small personal bribe. It was a coordinated political operation backed by the leadership of the Philistine cities. Samson had become a national threat. His defeat was worth a massive payment. Delilah accepted the task. The text does not describe an internal struggle. It does not tell us whether she loved Samson, feared the rulers, resented him, or saw only the silver. It simply records what she did. She asked Samson the question his enemies wanted answered. Please tell me where your great strength lies, and how you might be bound and subdued. The directness is almost shocking. Delilah did not hide her purpose behind a complicated story. She openly connected the secret of his strength with the possibility of binding and weakening him. Samson should have recognized the danger immediately. He had already lived through a similar pattern. At Timnah, men had been unable to solve his riddle and had pressured the woman closest to him for the answer. She had asked repeatedly until Samson revealed the secret, and she had passed it to the Philistines. Now another woman was asking him to expose hidden knowledge connected to his power. The warning was not subtle. It was a repetition of his own past. But Samson treated the question as a game. He told Delilah that if he were bound with 7 fresh bowstrings that had not been dried, he would become as weak as any other man. The answer was false. The Philistine rulers brought Delilah the fresh bowstrings, and she tied Samson with them. Men were waiting in hiding. Then Delilah cried out that the Philistines were upon him. Samson snapped the bowstrings as easily as a thread of flax breaks when it touches fire. The secret remained undiscovered. But the experiment revealed something Samson should not have ignored. Delilah had obtained exactly what he described. She had bound him while enemies waited nearby. She had shouted a warning at the moment of attack. This was not playful curiosity. His own words had been turned into an attempt to capture him. Yet Samson stayed. Delilah accused him of mocking her and lying. Now please tell me how you may be bound. Samson gave a second false answer. If he were tied securely with new ropes that had never been used, he said, he would become as weak as another man. The detail echoed his earlier experience at Lehi, where the men of Judah had bound him with new ropes. Those ropes had failed when the Spirit rushed upon him. Delilah took new ropes and bound him. Again, men waited in hiding. Again, she cried that the Philistines were upon him. Again, Samson broke the ropes from his arms as though they were threads. The pattern was now unmistakable. Each answer produced an actual attempt. Each attempt was connected to Philistine attackers. Each escape proved Samson's power, but each escape also revealed his recklessness. He did not leave Delilah. He did not confront the hidden men. He did not ask why the exact conditions he described were being recreated around him. He remained inside the danger because he believed he could control it. Delilah pressed him again. You have mocked me and told me lies. Tell me how you may be bound. Samson moved his answer closer to the truth. This time, he mentioned his hair. He told her that if she wove the 7 locks of his head into the fabric on a loom and fastened them tightly, he would become weak. The answer was still false, but the game had crossed an important boundary. At first, Samson spoke of bowstrings. Then he spoke of ropes. Now he brought his hair into the deception. The visible sign of his consecration had entered the conversation. Samson was moving closer to the secret he should have guarded. While he slept, Delilah wove the locks of his hair into the loom and secured them. Then she cried again that the Philistines were upon him. Samson awakened and pulled away the pin in the loom and the woven fabric. His strength remained. But the progression should have terrified him. The first lies had concerned objects placed around his body. The third involved his hair. Delilah was not moving away from the truth. She was moving toward it, and Samson was guiding her. The strong man could see the trap forming, yet he continued walking deeper inside it. Why the text does not explain his thoughts. Perhaps Samson believed he could enjoy the contest indefinitely. Perhaps each successful escape increased his confidence. Perhaps he interpreted Delilah's questions as evidence of affection rather than betrayal. Perhaps he believed that even if he came close to revealing the truth, he would always stop before crossing the final line. Whatever he thought, his behavior showed that he no longer treated his consecration with fear. The secret was becoming entertainment. The calling announced before his birth was becoming material for a private game with a woman connected to his enemies. Samson had carried the gates of Gaza away on his shoulders, but he was now allowing Delilah to approach a far more important boundary. The hair itself was not magical. It was a sign. No razor had touched Samson's head because he had been set apart to God from the womb. His strength came from the Lord, not from a physical substance within his hair. But to surrender that sign knowingly would reveal something deeper than a haircut. It would mean treating his consecration as disposable. It would mean handing another person access to the visible mark of the calling he had spent his life taking for granted. The Philistines had finally found the correct battlefield. They were no longer trying to defeat Samson's arms. They were waiting for Samson to betray his own calling. Delilah continued pressing him. Day after day, her words weighed upon him. The man who could resist armies began to weaken beneath persistent emotional pressure. He had seen this pattern before. He had heard the same kind of appeal at Timnah. He knew what happened when a secret passed from his lips into the hands of someone connected to the Philistines. But Samson remained. He had broken every rope placed around his body. Now an invisible bond was tightening around his judgment. And the closer Delilah came to the truth, the less seriously Samson treated the danger. If this documentary is helping you see how each event in Samson's life connects to the next, save it so you can return to the full timeline later. Samson's downfall did not begin with one sudden failure. It developed through choices that seemed survivable until the final boundary was crossed. Delilah would not need to overpower him. She would only need to keep asking. And Samson, who had never learned when to leave, was about to tell her everything. Delilah kept asking. Day after day she pressed Samson to reveal the truth about his strength. The false answers had failed. Fresh bowstrings had snapped. New ropes had broken. His hair had been woven into a loom, yet he had still awakened and pulled himself free. Each test had exposed the danger more clearly. Each time Samson described a way to bind him, Delilah recreated it. Each time she cried that the Philistines were upon him, men were waiting nearby. Each time Samson escaped, he received another warning. But he did not leave. The strongest man in Israel remained in the place where his enemies had repeatedly tried to capture him. Delilah changed her approach. She no longer asked only for information. She challenged the relationship itself. How can you say I love you when your heart is not with me? The accusation struck Samson at the point where he was most vulnerable. She compared his secrecy with rejection. If he truly loved her, she argued, he would not withhold the truth. He had mocked her 3 times, she said, and had not told her where his great strength came from. The reasoning was manipulative, but it was effective. Delilah treated access to Samson's consecration as proof of love. The question was no longer presented as a threat, it became a test of emotional loyalty. Samson had faced this kind of pressure before. At Timnah, his wife had wept and accused him of not loving her because he refused to explain the riddle. Samson had eventually surrendered the answer, and it had passed directly to the Philistine men. The earlier betrayal should have taught him what persistent pressure could produce. Instead, the same pattern returned in a more dangerous form. The first secret had been the answer to a riddle. This secret concerned the sign of his lifelong calling. Delilah pressed him daily with her words until, as the text describes it, his soul was troubled to death. The expression conveys emotional exhaustion. Samson was not physically overpowered. No soldier had entered the room. No chain had been fastened around him. Yet the constant pressure wore down his resistance. He wanted relief, and in seeking relief from her words, he surrendered the protection of silence. Samson opened his heart to her. He told Delilah that no razor had ever touched his head because he had been a Nazirite to God from his mother's womb. If his head were shaved, he said his strength would leave him and he would become weak like any other man. For the first time, Samson spoke directly about his consecration. The secret was not simply that his hair had never been cut. The deeper truth was that his life had been set apart before birth. His mother had received the command before he existed. His father had prayed for instruction. The angel of the Lord had ascended in the flame of an offering. The child had grown beneath divine blessing. The Spirit had begun to stir him between Zorah and Eshtaol. His uncut hair had served as a visible sign that his life belonged to God. Now Samson handed that knowledge to Delilah. The tragedy is not that he accidentally spoke one wrong sentence. He had moved toward this moment for years. He had treated consecration as a boundary he could repeatedly approach without consequence. He had touched the lion's carcass and concealed the source of the honey. He had entered Philistine feasts and cities. He had allowed personal desire to direct major choices. He had made his hair part of the game before finally revealing its meaning. The final confession was sudden, but the compromise was not. Samson's downfall was the visible end of a long inward direction. Delilah recognized that he had told her the truth. Perhaps something in his tone changed. Perhaps the details carried a seriousness absent from the previous answers. The text simply says that she saw he had opened his whole heart. She sent word to the Philistine rulers. "Come up once more," she told them, "for he has told me all his heart." The rulers returned carrying the silver they had promised. They had heard false reports before, but this time Delilah spoke with certainty. Their years of military failure were about to be reversed through one man's betrayal of his own calling. Delilah caused Samson to sleep on her lap. The image appears peaceful. Samson rested beside the woman he loved, believing himself secure enough to become unconscious in the place where 3 previous attacks had been attempted. He had broken every restraint she had tested. Perhaps he believed the final secret would make no difference. Perhaps he thought he would awaken before anything serious occurred. Perhaps he assumed that strength had become so natural to him that it could never truly leave. The text does not tell us what he expected. It tells us only what happened. Delilah summoned a man to shave off the 7 locks of Samson's head. The razor passed through hair that had never been cut. The visible sign of his consecration fell away. Delilah began to torment or weaken him, and his strength left him. Then she cried the familiar warning once more. "The Philistines are upon you, Samson!" He awakened. The pattern had happened 3 times before. Each time he had risen, broken the restraint, and escaped. So Samson thought, "I will go out as at other times and shake myself free." That sentence reveals the presumption that had grown inside him. As at other times. Samson expected the past to repeat itself. He had escaped before. He had broken ropes before. He had awakened in danger before. He believed he could act as he always had and receive the same result. But he did not know that the Lord had departed from him. These are among the darkest words in Samson's story. The tragedy is not merely that Samson lost physical strength. He did not know what had changed. His confidence remained after the source of his power was gone. He rose expecting victory, but the gift he had treated as permanent was no longer available to him. The text does not suggest that God's power was trapped within Samson's hair. Hair is not presented as a magical object capable of producing supernatural force. The hair was the sign of his consecration. By surrendering the secret and permitting that sign to be removed, Samson brought the long pattern of disregard to its decisive moment. The Lord's departure was not the mechanical result of a haircut. It was the judgment connected to a consecration betrayed. Samson had confused repeated mercy with guaranteed protection. He had assumed that because the Lord had empowered him many times, the power would always appear whenever he demanded it. He had treated divine strength as though it belonged to him. Now he discovered that a gift can be withdrawn. The Philistines seized him. For the first time, Samson could not escape. The men who had waited in hiding rushed forward, and the strong man who had once terrified armies became an ordinary prisoner in their hands. They gouged out his eyes. The violence was both physical and symbolic. Samson's adult story had begun with sight. He saw the Philistine woman in Timnah and demanded her because she was right in his eyes. Again and again, his eyes had helped direct his desires. He saw what he wanted and moved toward it. Now the Philistines destroyed the eyes that had guided so many of his choices. The man who had lived by sight entered darkness. They took him down to Gaza, the city whose gates Samson had once torn from their foundations, now received him as a captive. He had entered Gaza freely before and carried away its defenses. Now he returned blind, bound, and powerless. The reversal was complete. The gate carrier became the prisoner behind the gate. The terror of Philistia became a trophy of Philistine victory. They bound him with bronze chains. Earlier ropes had failed. Fresh bowstrings had snapped. New cords had fallen from his arms like burned threads. But Samson could not break these chains. The difference was not in the material. The difference was in the absence of the power he had taken for granted. The Philistines placed him in prison and forced him to grind grain. Grinding was repetitive, exhausting labor. A prisoner could be made to push a heavy millstone in circles, performing the same motion again and again. Samson's life had once been defined by movement across borders, sudden battles, and acts of overwhelming strength. Now his world became a circle in darkness. Step after step, turn after turn, day after day. The man who had moved wherever desire led him could no longer choose his direction. His enemies controlled his movement. His chains controlled his reach. His blindness controlled what he could know. The humiliation was deliberate. The Philistines did not immediately kill Samson. They wanted him alive. A dead enemy could be remembered as a martyr or a warrior. A living captive could be displayed as proof of victory. Samson's imprisonment sent a message throughout Philistia. The man who had burned their fields had been captured. The man who had killed their warriors was now performing forced labor. The man who had torn away the gates of Gaza could not leave a prison cell. The rulers had finally subdued him. Or so they believed. In the darkness of the prison, Samson could no longer rely on the things that had defined him publicly. No crowd watched his strength. No riddle demonstrated his cleverness. No Philistine woman admired him. No enemy fled before him. No victory song could hide his dependence. He was left with his failure. The text does not record Samson's thoughts during these days. It does not give a speech of repentance from the prison. It does not describe a vision, a dream, or a conversation with a priest. We should not invent what Scripture leaves unspoken, but the silence itself carries weight. Samson had spent much of his life acting before reflecting. Now he had no choice but to remain still within the consequences of his actions. He could remember the promise surrounding his birth. He could remember the stories his parents may have told him about the angelic announcement. He could remember the lion, the wedding, the fire, the jawbone, the spring, and the gates of Gaza. He could remember every warning, and he could remember waking beside Delilah, expecting to escape as at other times. His downfall had exposed a truth he had resisted throughout his life. Strength had never made him independent of God. The Lord's power was not Samson's possession. It was a gift connected to a calling. Without it, Samson was not the invincible man he imagined himself to be. He was vulnerable. He was human. He was in need of mercy. The Philistines interpreted his capture differently. To them, Samson's defeat was not merely political or military. It was religious. Ancient warfare was often understood as conflict involving the gods of rival peoples. A victory could be celebrated as proof that one deity had triumphed over another. The Philistines worshipped Dagon. Now they believed Dagon had delivered Samson into their hands. They did not see Samson's capture as judgment upon his compromise within the purpose of Israel's God. They saw it as evidence that their God had defeated the God of Israel. This interpretation would shape the final gathering. Samson's humiliation would become entertainment. His chains would become a reason for worship. His blindness would become proof of Philistine superiority, and the rulers who had paid Delilah would stand before their people as the leaders who finally destroyed the man no army could defeat. But inside the prison, something began to change. The text records one quiet detail. The hair on Samson's head began to grow again after it had been shaved. The sentence is small, but its placement is deliberate. The hair itself did not create power. Its growth did not automatically restore the broken relationship between Samson and the Lord. But it signaled that the story was not finished. The visible mark of consecration had begun to return. While the Philistines celebrated the permanence of their victory, time was moving forward. While they saw only a blind prisoner, the sign they had removed was reappearing. While Samson walked in circles, the final confrontation was being prepared. The rulers did not notice. They had discovered how to capture Samson, but they had misunderstood what his defeat meant. They believed that because they had cut his hair, they had conquered his God. They believed that because the Lord had departed from Samson, the Lord had abandoned his purpose. They believed that the man in chains could never again become dangerous. Their confidence would soon gather thousands of people beneath one roof. The rulers of the Philistines arranged a great sacrifice to Dagon. They would celebrate their God. They would praise him for delivering Samson into their hands. They would bring out their captives so the people could look at him, mock him, and laugh at the fallen judge of Israel. Samson would enter the temple blind. He would have no weapon. He would have no army. He would be surrounded by the rulers who had purchased his betrayal, and by thousands who believed his life had become proof that Dagon had won. But the final battle of Samson's life would not begin with his hands. It would begin with a prayer. The rulers of the Philistines gathered to offer a great sacrifice to Dagon. The occasion was more than a religious ceremony. It was a public celebration of national victory. For years, Samson had humiliated Philistine power. He had killed men in Ashkelon, destroyed harvest fields, defeated a large force at Lehi, and carried away the gates of Gaza. He had moved through their territory like a threat no army could contain. Now he was blind. He was chained. He was grinding grain inside a Philistine prison. The rulers believed the long conflict had finally ended, and they gave the credit to their God. "Our God has delivered Samson, our enemy, into our hands," they proclaimed. The words reveal how the Philistines understood the moment. They did not see Samson's fall as the consequence of his own compromise. They did not know that his strength had always come from the Spirit of the Lord. They did not understand that the God of Israel had judged Samson without surrendering his authority over the story. They saw only what appeared visible. Dagon had won. Samson had lost. The God of Israel had been defeated. The people joined the celebration. When they saw Samson, they praised their God again. They remembered the destruction he had caused in their land and the number of their people he had killed. The man who had once filled their cities with fear now stood as proof that no enemy could resist Philistine power forever. Their relief became worship. Their worship became mockery. Their mockery became overconfidence. As their hearts grew merry, they called for Samson to be brought out so he could entertain them. The text does not describe exactly what kind of performance they demanded. They may have expected him to stumble, dance, struggle, or simply endure public humiliation while the crowd laughed. Whatever the form, the purpose was clear. Samson was no longer treated as a warrior or judge. He was a spectacle. The man once set apart to begin Israel's deliverance had become entertainment in the temple of Israel's oppressors. The scene completes a series of reversals. Samson had once entered Philistine territory by choice. Now he was brought where others commanded. He had once looked upon whatever pleased him. Now he could see nothing. He had once broken ropes and carried gates. Now a servant guided his steps. He had once made riddles for others to solve. Now his enemies believed his entire life had become a joke they understood. They placed him between the pillars of the temple. The building was crowded. The Philistine rulers were present, along with a vast assembly of men and women. The text also mentions about 3,000 people on the roof watching Samson perform. The exact design of the structure is not described in detail, and we should not pretend to reconstruct every architectural feature with certainty. But the account makes clear that two central pillars played a crucial role in supporting the building. Samson stood near them. To the crowd, the pillars represented stability. To Samson, they represented the final possibility of action. He spoke to the young servant who held his hand. "Let me feel the pillars on which the house rests," he said, "that I may lean against them." The request sounded harmless. A blind prisoner might reasonably need support. The servant had no reason to believe Samson could threaten the building. Everyone knew his strength had disappeared. The rulers had captured him, chained him, and displayed him publicly. So the servant guided Samson toward the pillars. Samson placed himself between them. The crowd continued celebrating. They could not see the battle taking place inside the blind man. For most of his life, Samson had responded to danger through immediate physical action. He tore the lion apart. He struck men in anger. He burned fields. He broke ropes. He lifted gates. But now, action alone was impossible. He had no strength of his own sufficient for what he intended. For perhaps the clearest time in his story, Samson had to begin by acknowledging his complete dependence upon God. He prayed, "O Lord God, please remember me. Please strengthen me, only this once, O God, that I may be avenged on the Philistines for my 2 eyes." The prayer is brief. It is also complicated. Samson asks the Lord to remember him. This does not imply that God had forgotten his existence. In biblical prayer, asking God to remember often means asking him to act again according to mercy, covenant, or purpose. Samson knew what he had lost. He no longer assumed that strength would appear automatically. He did not say, "I will go out as at other times." He asked, "Please strengthen me." The man who had treated divine power as though it belonged to him now recognized that only God could give it. But Samson's motive remained personal. He asked for vengeance for his eyes. The prayer does not suddenly transform him into a flawless hero. His concern is still connected to what the Philistines had done to him. He does not offer a long confession, nor does he speak explicitly about Israel's freedom or the honor of the Lord's name. Samson remains Samson. His faith and his brokenness are both present. Yet something has changed. Before, he acted as though strength were his possession. Now he prays as a dependent servant. Before, he walked into danger, trusting his ability to escape. Now he knows that escape is impossible. Before, he protected his own life while striking others. Now he understands that the final act will cost him everything. Samson took hold of the two central pillars. He placed one hand against one and the other hand against the second. Then he said, "Let me die with the Philistines." There was no path back to freedom. He was not trying to escape the temple. He was not attempting to restore his former life. He had reached the point where the completion of his final act and his own death had become inseparable. Samson pushed with all his strength. The power did not arise from the returning length of his hair as though the hair contained magic. The hair's growth had signaled that the visible mark of his consecration was returning, but the strength came because God answered his prayer. The pillars moved. The support beneath the temple failed. The building began to collapse. The sound of celebration turned into confusion. Stone, timber, and bodies fell together. The roof, crowded with spectators, came down upon those below. The rulers who had paid for Samson's betrayal could not escape. The people who had praised Dagon for delivering their enemy into their hands were buried inside Dagon's own temple. Samson died beneath the destruction. So did thousands of Philistines. The narrator gives the final judgment on the scale of the event. The dead whom Samson killed at his death were more than those he had killed during his life. His last act became his greatest blow against Philistine power. The statement does not reduce his earlier life to nothing. His previous victories had weakened Israel's oppressors and created fear throughout their territory. But the temple collapse reached the leadership and religious confidence of Philistine society at the same time. Their rulers had gathered. Their people had gathered. Their praise of Dagon had reached its highest point. Then the celebration became judgment. The Philistines had brought Samson into the temple to prove that their God had defeated him. Instead, the temple fell around them through the strength given by the God of Israel. The theological confrontation is impossible to miss. This was not simply a prisoner destroying a building. The Philistines had made Samson's captivity a statement about their God's superiority. They had interpreted his humiliation as Dagon's triumph. The collapse answered that claim. Dagon had not defeated the Lord. Philistine power had not escaped divine judgment. Samson's failure was real, but it had never transferred authority from the God of Israel to the gods of Israel's enemies. The Lord could discipline his servant and still judge those who treated that discipline as proof of divine weakness. The victory, however, was tragic. Samson did not walk out of the ruins. He did not return to Israel with a restored vision. He did not gather the tribes or enjoy the freedom his final act helped create. His deliverance came through death. This is why Samson's story refuses to fit comfortably into the shape of a simple heroic legend. He was not a warrior who consistently obeyed and finally received honor. He was not merely a villain destroyed by his own sin. He was a chosen deliverer whose gifts were genuine, whose failures were severe, and whose final act contained faith, vengeance, sacrifice, judgment, and tragedy at the same moment. His death fulfilled the limitation announced before his birth. The angel of the Lord had said that Samson would begin to deliver Israel from the Philistines. He did not complete the work. The Philistines would remain a powerful enemy after his death. Their armies would confront Israel in the days of Samuel. They would defeat Saul and his sons on Mount Gilboa. Their champion Goliath would later stand against Israel until David faced him. Samson did not end Philistine oppression, but he struck their power at a critical point. He disrupted their control. He destroyed leaders gathered in one place. He demonstrated that their domination was not permanent, and that their gods could not protect them from the judgment of the Lord. His mission was incomplete, but it was not meaningless. The manner of his death also forces a difficult question. How should Samson's final act be understood? From a modern perspective, his decision to die while killing others can appear similar to forms of violence condemned in other contexts. But the biblical account presents the event within the ancient conflict between Israel and the Philistine oppressors, and within Samson's divinely announced role as a judge. The text does not present him attacking uninvolved strangers for ideological spectacle. The temple was filled with the political rulers and people publicly celebrating his capture as the victory of Dagon. Samson was an imprisoned judge asking God for strength against the enemy he had been called to confront. Even so, the story does not turn the deaths into light entertainment. The tone remains tragic. Samson dies because the path of compromise has carried him beyond recovery of his former life. His final victory cannot erase the blindness, chains, and prison that preceded it. The temple falls, but so does Samson. The enemy is judged, but the deliverer is buried beneath the same ruins. This is not the victory of a man who mastered his life. It is the final act of a man who learned dependence only after losing almost everything. Yet the prayer was answered. That fact matters. Samson had failed. He had treated his consecration carelessly. He had revealed the secret entrusted to him. He had assumed that the Lord's power would remain available whenever he chose to use it. But when he finally called upon God from the place of helplessness, the Lord heard him. The answer did not remove every consequence. God's mercy did not restore Samson's eyes. It did not open the prison and send him safely home. It did not return the years lost through pride and compromise. Mercy came within judgment, not instead of it. Samson was given strength one final time, but the strength carried him into the full consequence of the battle. This distinction is important. Forgiveness does not always erase earthly consequences. Restoration does not always mean returning to the life a person had before failure. Sometimes mercy appears as the opportunity to act faithfully within the ruins that cannot be undone. Samson could not rebuild his past, but he could place his remaining life back into the purpose for which he had been chosen. With one hand against each pillar, the man who had spent years following what was right in his own eyes finally acted while physically unable to see. In blindness, he depended upon God more clearly than he often had in sight. In weakness, he prayed more honestly than he had in strength. In captivity, he struck the greatest blow of his judgeship. The irony is painful. Samson's strength had always been most dangerous when he believed it belonged to him. It became meaningful again when he admitted that it had to be given. The temple lay in ruins. The Philistine celebration ended in silence. Their rulers were dead. Their claim that Dagon had defeated the God of Israel had collapsed with the building constructed for his worship. And somewhere beneath the wreckage lay the body of Samson. The promised child of the barren woman was dead. The Nazarite's hair had grown again, but his life had ended. The judge who had served Israel for 20 years would never see his homeland again. Yet his story did not end anonymously beneath Philistine stones. News of the disaster reached his family. His brothers and the members of his father's household came down to recover his body. The family that had once received him as a miraculous child would now carry him home as a fallen judge. They would bury him between Zorah and Eshtaol, near the place where the Spirit of the Lord had first begun to stir him. His journey would end close to where his calling had begun. But the final meaning of Samson's life could not be measured only by the number of enemies beneath the temple. Was he a faithful deliverer? Was he a warning against compromise? Was he a tragic failure? Why would the New Testament later include his name among those remembered in connection with faith? And what legacy did he leave to Israel, to the judges who came before him, and to the generations who would continue fighting the Philistines after he was gone? The pillars had fallen, the battle was over, but the judgment of Samson's life still remained. Samson's brothers and the members of his father's household traveled into Philistine territory to recover his body. The journey must have carried them through the region where the consequences of his final act were still visible. The Temple of Dagon had collapsed. Philistine rulers were dead. Thousands who had gathered to celebrate Samson's humiliation had perished beneath the ruins. But Samson's family did not come to celebrate a military victory. They came to bury their son and brother. They lifted his body from the wreckage and carried him away from Gaza, the city where he had once torn the gates from their foundations, and where he had later entered as a blind prisoner. They took him back toward the land of his birth. Samson was buried between Zorah and Eshtaol in the tomb of Manoah, his father. The location brings his story full circle. Between Zorah and Eshtaol, the Spirit of the Lord had first begun to stir him. It was there that the promised child began moving toward the mission announced before his birth. Now, after years of strength, conflict, failure, captivity, and one final act of judgment, his body returned to the same region. The journey that had begun with divine promise ended in a family tomb. The book of Judges closes Samson's account with a brief statement he had judged Israel for 20 years. Those words confirm his place among Israel's deliverers, but they also preserve the incompleteness of his work. Samson had not created a lasting government. He had not united the tribes. He had not removed Philistine power from the land. He had not brought Israel into a long period of covenant faithfulness. The Philistines remained a major threat after his death. In the generation that followed, they would continue pressing into Israelite territory. During the days of Samuel, they would capture the Ark of the Covenant and carry it into Philistine cities. During the reign of Saul, their armies would remain powerful enough to threaten the emerging monarchy. Saul and his sons would eventually die in battle against them. Even David, the future king, would first become known throughout Israel by confronting a Philistine champion. Samson's mission had never been described as the complete liberation of Israel. Before his birth, the angel of the Lord had said that he would begin to save Israel from the hand of the Philistines. That is exactly what his life accomplished. He disrupted Philistine power. He shattered the assumption that their control could not be challenged. He destroyed crops, struck military forces, humiliated fortified cities, and finally killed many of their rulers in the collapse of Dagon's temple. His actions weakened the enemy and opened a conflict that later leaders would continue. Samson began the work. Others would carry it forward. But his legacy cannot be measured only by the number of Philistines he defeated. His life also stands as one of Scripture's clearest warnings about the difference between receiving a gift and developing the character required to carry it faithfully. Samson was chosen before birth. His calling was not imaginary. The announcement to his mother was real. His consecration was real. The blessing of the Lord was real. The Spirit's power upon him was real. His failures do not prove that he was never called. At the same time, his calling does not make his failures insignificant. Samson's story refuses both extremes. It does not permit us to dismiss him as nothing more than a corrupt and violent man, because the text repeatedly shows God empowering him in Israel's struggle against the Philistines. But it also does not permit us to transform him into a flawless superhero, because the text openly records his impulsiveness, anger, secrecy, presumption, and inability to govern his desires. Scripture does not hide the weaknesses of its deliverers, because the biblical story was never built upon human perfection. Samson's strength came from God. His downfall came through choices he repeatedly made. Both truths belong to his legacy. From his first adult decision, Samson was guided by what appeared right in his own eyes. He saw the woman at Timnah and demanded her. He approached danger as though strength would always protect him from consequences. He treated his secrets as instruments of control. He moved closer and closer to the boundaries of his consecration, while assuming that nothing essential would change. The consequences did not arrive immediately. That delay may have made his choices appear safe. He touched the lion's carcass, yet remained strong. He entered a destructive marriage, yet survived. He revealed the answer to his riddle, yet later defeated his enemies. He entered Gaza for immoral purposes, yet carried away its gates. He lied to Delilah 3 times, yet broke every restraint. Each escape could have been understood as mercy. Instead, Samson increasingly treated escape as a guarantee. He believed he could rise as he had at other times. That assumption became fatal. Samson's downfall did not begin when the razor touched his hair. It began when he repeatedly treated consecration as something that could be approached carelessly. The cutting of his hair was the final visible act in a much longer inward surrender. His hair was not magical. The biblical account does not teach that supernatural power existed inside each strand. The uncut hair served as the visible sign that Samson had been separated to God from the womb. His strength came from the Lord. When Samson disclosed the secret of his consecration and allowed its sign to be removed, he exposed how little reverence remained in his treatment of the calling. The most frightening moment in his fall was not that Samson awoke weak. It was that he awoke confident. He expected to escape. He did not know that the Lord had departed from him. He still possessed the habits of strength after the strength itself was gone. This is one of the deepest warnings in his life. A person may continue assuming that yesterday's gift will compensate for today's disobedience. Past victories can create confidence without producing faithfulness. Public success can hide inward collapse. A person may appear strongest at the very moment the foundation beneath that strength has already begun to fail. Samson could tear apart a lion, but he could not consistently master desire. He could break ropes, but he could not break the pattern of returning to dangerous relationships. He could uproot city gates, but he could not establish lasting boundaries within his own life. He could destroy an enemy's harvest, but he could not stop anger from multiplying destruction. He could defeat 1,000 men, but he could not recognize when one conversation was leading him toward ruin. His greatest weakness was not Delilah. Delilah exploited a weakness Samson had carried for years. His deepest enemy was the belief that strength made wisdom unnecessary. The consequences were severe. He lost his freedom, he lost his sight, he lost the power he had treated as permanent. He returned to Gaza not as the man carrying its gates, but as a captive inside its prison. Yet Samson's story does not end only with judgment. In the Temple of Dagon, the broken judge prayed. The text does not record a complete confession of every sin. It does not explicitly describe a long process of repentance. We should not claim more than Scripture reveals. But the final prayer does show a change in Samson's understanding of power. Earlier, he had expected to escape, as at other times. In the temple, he asked God to strengthen him. He no longer acted as though power belonged naturally to him. He recognized his dependence. He asked to be remembered. He placed the final outcome in God's hands. The Lord answered. That answer did not erase the consequences of Samson's choices. His eyes were not restored. His years in prison were not removed. His freedom was not returned. He did not survive the collapse. Mercy did not carry him backward into the life he had lost. It allowed him to act within the ruins. Samson's final victory, therefore, contains both grace and judgment. God heard a man who had failed. God empowered a servant who had treated his calling carelessly. But Samson's restored strength did not remove the cost of his failure. He died with the Philistines. The temple collapse became a judgment upon Philistine power, but it also became the grave of Israel's judge. This is why Samson's final act should not be reduced to a simple message that everything eventually worked out. Everything did not return to the way it had been. His life ended tragically. His family carried home a body, not a victorious leader. Israel received a blow against its enemies, but not complete freedom. The Philistines lost rulers, yet remained powerful. Samson's final act mattered greatly, but it did not undo every earlier choice. The New Testament later names Samson in Hebrews 11. The chapter remembers men and women who acted through faith, often in situations where God's promises appeared greater than their circumstances. Samson's name appears alongside Gideon, Barak, Jephthah, David, Samuel, and the prophets. His inclusion may surprise readers who remember primarily his failures. But Hebrews does not claim that every choice made by each person listed was righteous. The chapter celebrates faith without pretending that the people who exercised it were morally flawless. Samson belongs there, not because his life was free from compromise, but because his story still contains moments of genuine dependence upon God. He faced enemies greater than one man could defeat. The Spirit empowered him. At Lehi, he called upon the Lord when he was dying of thirst. In the temple, he prayed for strength when he had none of his own. Faith does not transform every act of Samson's life into an example to imitate. It shows that God could work through him and hear him, even within a life marked by contradiction. Samson was faithful and faithless at different moments. He was powerful and helpless. He was called and compromised. He was victorious and defeated. He judged Israel, yet often resembled the disordered nation he was meant to deliver. In this way, Samson becomes a living reflection of the entire period of the Judges. Israel had been chosen by God, but repeatedly turned toward other gods. Samson had been consecrated to God, but repeatedly moved toward Philistine relationships and territory. Israel possessed a covenant, but treated it lightly. Samson carried the sign of consecration, but treated it lightly. Israel needed deliverance from external enemies, but its deeper problem was internal rebellion. Samson could strike the Philistines around him, but he could not fully defeat the disorder within himself. The judge resembled the nation. Both needed a greater kind of deliverance. The book of Judges continues after Samson into some of the darkest events in Israel's early history. The final chapters describe idolatry, violence, social collapse, and civil war. The repeated conclusion is that Israel had no king, and everyone did what was right in his own eyes. Samson's story has already shown the danger of that condition on a personal scale. Extraordinary strength cannot save a person who allows desire to become the final authority. Nor can one heroic figure permanently rescue a nation whose heart remains unchanged. Israel would eventually demand a king. Kings would rise. Some would defeat enemies, expand territory, and establish political order. But even the monarchy would reveal the same problem. Human leaders could bring temporary deliverance, yet they too could fall through pride, desire, fear, and disobedience. Samson's incomplete victory, therefore, points beyond himself. Israel needed more than a stronger judge. It needed more than a larger army. It needed more than a king capable of defeating the Philistines. It needed faithful leadership, inward renewal, and a deliverance that addressed not only oppression from outside, but rebellion within. Samson's story does not offer an easy hero to admire from a distance. It offers a warning close enough to examine the heart. What gifts have been mistaken for character? What repeated escapes have been mistaken for approval? What boundaries have been approached so often that danger no longer feels dangerous? What secret compromises remain hidden because visible strength still appears intact? These questions are part of Samson's legacy. His story reminds us that being used for a purpose does not eliminate the need for obedience. Strength is not the same as maturity. Boldness is not the same as wisdom. Success is not always evidence of faithfulness, and the ability to defeat an enemy does not guarantee victory over oneself. Yet his story also reveals that failure does not place a person beyond the possibility of calling upon God. Samson prayed from blindness, captivity, and the consequences of his own decisions. He could not repair everything, but he could still acknowledge dependence. He could still ask to be remembered, and God could still act through the life that remained. This is not permission to treat grace carelessly. It is a reason not to confuse judgment with abandonment. Samson was buried between Zorah and Eshtaol. His father's tomb received the son whose birth had once seemed impossible. The child announced by an angel had become Israel's strongest judge. The strongest judge had become a blind prisoner. The blind prisoner had prayed. The prayer had brought down a temple. And the fallen temple had become both his greatest victory and his grave. Samson's life ended, but the struggle with the Philistines continued. His strength disappeared, but the purpose of God moved forward. His failures remained a warning, and his final dependence remained a testimony. If you followed Samson's complete journey to the end, share in the comments which biblical character should receive the next full documentary. Subscribe to continue exploring Scripture as one connected story, and watch the next episode to see how Israel moved from the age of the judges towards Samuel, Saul, David, and the rise of the kingdom. Samson could move pillars, carry gates, and defeat armies. But his legacy reminds us that the greatest strength is not the power to overcome others. It is the faithfulness to govern what lies within.